education and take away more of the local control that we appreciate. And of course, the list goes on and on. And so I thought, well, what could they possibly do for an encore to that? And so the other day, I went to look at their platform for the Democrat Party for our nation. I couldn't understand any of it. I don't speak any French. It didn't dawn on me. But you have a country now where the attitude of the governing leadership of this nation is a federal government overreach to the point that they're taking over every day another bit of our freedom, another bit of our liberty, another bit of our entrepreneurial spirit, another bit of our individual responsibility, another discouragement towards our faith and our values. And for those people in this room, and for patriots all across this country, it is time to send the same message they sent in the special elections in New Jersey last year, the same message they sent in the elections in Virginia last year, the same message that was sent in the recent Massachusetts Senate race, and the message is this: knock it off, stop what you're doing, and stop having this government overreach. We've had enough. And it's time for those of us in this room and others across this nation to push back and take this country back. So after all the talk of the 2008 elections about hope and change, what we have now are state-sponsored companies that are too big to fail. We have a federal government that is too big to succeed. We have a government debt that is too big to pay off. And we have leaders at the federal level who are too small to do anything about it. This cannot stand. And now we have a situation where Wall Street gets bailout, the poor understandably get a handout, and all of you in this room get your wallet out. And I think the American people have figured out that formula where big business, big unions, and big government are now working in ways that are not in the best interest of average, hardworking Americans and their families. And that's why you see this anger. That's why you see this passion. That's why you see this call for accountability coming not just from the established parties, but from everyday average citizens on the internet, at the tea parties, in town halls, all across this country saying, enough. We've had enough. And so I'm delighted to be here with you tonight and send the message that hope is on the way, that there is a better way. A lot of attention gets paid to the fact that Massachusetts is a very liberal state, and it is. But remember now, I come from Minnesota. Massachusetts went for Ronald Reagan twice. Minnesota never went for Ronald Reagan. I'm not proud of that, but there was one year, one election, where Ronald Reagan won 49 out of 50 states. There was one state he did not win. Guess which one it was? Minnesota. So some of you may be old enough to remember Eugene McCarthy from Minnesota. Some of you may remember Hubert Humphrey from Minnesota. Some of you may remember Walter Mondale, Minnesota. Some of you may remember the late Paul Wellstone from Minnesota. Some of you will certainly remember now the current United States Senator from Minnesota, United States Senator Al Franken. So when people talk about the challenges in the Northeast, or they talk about the challenges in Massachusetts, or they talk about the challenges of the conservative opportunity in the Great Lakes or the Upper Midwest or places like that, I know a little bit about that. I ran as a conservative 2 times in a state and won, in 2002, and in a year that was pretty tough, 2006. And here's just a quick snippet of some of the things we've done in Minnesota. We've taken the spending curve from 1960 until I became governor. Minnesota's state budget went up 21% on average every 2 years. 21% on average every 2 years. We have brought that down now to just about zero, approaching zero. And for the first time in the state's history, actually cut spending. Now, this next one may not seem like a big deal to those in the Granite State, but for 30 years, governors of both parties in Minnesota have said, can we at least get this state out of the top 10 states in taxes? You wouldn't think that's too much to ask. Kelly, would you? No, I wouldn't think so. 30 years worth of governors, 30 years worth of efforts. Nobody ever did it. We were always first, second, third in taxes until just a couple of years ago when the federal government certified that we had now moved Minnesota out of the top 10 in taxes after cutting taxes and holding the line on taxes. Now, I think we're already down to all the way to like 12th, but we're headed in the right direction. We have made reforms in education to do things like move from seniority pay for teachers to performance pay for teachers, demanding accountability for results, not just inputs. We're fixing what is for sure a broken healthcare system, but we're doing that by using market forces and putting individuals and their families in charge of healthcare, not the government. And we're making sure that when the word goes out across this state and across the country that there needs to be change, we can point to Minnesota and say, as Frank Sinatra sang about New York, if we can do it here, we can do it anywhere. So I want to just leave you with a few principles that I'm grounded in, that I hope you're grounded in. And a lot of people say, well, I'm a Tea Party conservative, or I'm a Reagan conservative, or I'm a common sense conservative, or down the list. Those are all really good words. But I hope we start the discussion with this frame of reference. We should be constitutional conservatives first. And I was talking to somebody here earlier on one of the tables who has spent a good deal of their time teaching young people a historical perspective about the Constitution, and have the Constitution teach the lessons of today's debate from the eyes and ears and words of the founders as reflected in those documents. It's a powerful, powerful experience. And these values, these principles are all just one generation away from being discounted or diminished or forgotten. And those of us who appreciate and respect and defend those principles need to make sure that they're taught, that they're role modeled, that they're passed on to the next generation. So I want to, from that, the common sense flows, and from my standpoint, a lot of that comes from our family. We learned a little bit earlier about Shirley. What a great story. And I grew up in a meatpacking town. You mentioned that her parents, I think, had a rendering plant or worked in a rendering plant. So in my hometown, we had the South St. Paul stockyards, the world's largest stockyards, the world's largest meatpacking plants. My dad was a truck driver for much of his life. My mom was a homemaker for much of her life. She died when I was 16. I was the only one in my family who was able to go to college. My brothers and sisters did things like work in oil refineries and work for 40 years in the produce department of a grocery store. And one of my sisters is a special ed aide for disabled kids in the public schools, and my other sisters worked as a secretary or administrative assistant for 40 years or so. And I share that with you because we are all rooted in kind of the experience and the upbringing and the values that we are taught in our family of origin, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, in our schools. And you learn some things along the way. Here's a few that I've learned that I think apply real well to the debates that are going on in this nation. And the first one is this: we can't spend more than we have. So I remember my mom sitting at the kitchen table. For some people, this is a metaphor. For me, this was my family. This was my memory. We didn't have a lot of money. My mom would sit at that kitchen table with the family checkbook and fret almost to the point of tears, wondering about how we're going to pay the bills, how we're going to manage cash flows so we could get the bills paid on time. And she would call together my dad and others in our family and say, look, this is what we have. This is what we can afford. There's some things we can do, and then there's some things we can't do. And so one thing they knew, though, is that we weren't going to go into debt. And we weren't going to be irresponsible about that. Now we have a United States federal government who is so far in debt that has put this nation so at risk, has put this nation at such peril, that they not only endanger our economic security and our prosperity, but it's gotten so bad that they are now putting at risk our national security over these issues. Let me give you just a couple of numbers. the United States federal government takes in $2.2 trillion or so in funds, in revenues from all sources.